Our scripture reading this morning is going to be from Luke chapter 1, verses 67 through 74. And his father Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied, saying, Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people, and has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from of old, that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show the mercy promised to our fathers and to remember his holy covenant, the oath that he swore to our father Abraham to grant us, that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear.
Good morning. Let me see if I can get it to work. Turn on. Next slide. Perfect. If you have a Bible with you, go ahead and open with me to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, that's where our text will be coming from. I want to thank Hadley for reading that first part of Zechariah's prophecy for us. I want to thank Adam for his song leading, pulling out some deep cuts this morning. I appreciate that. And while we're opened right here, let's go ahead and read the beginning of the narrative, everything that builds up to this prophecy that was just read for us. So we'll begin in verse 57. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son. And her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. And on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they would have called him Zechariah after his father. But his mother answered, No, he shall be called John. And they said to her, None of your relatives is called by that name. And they made signs to his father, inquiring that what he wanted him to be called. Verse 63. And he asked for a writing tablet, and he wrote, His name is John. And they all wondered. And immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue loosed, and he spoke, blessing God. And fear came on all their neighbors, and all these things were talked about through all the hill country of Judea. And all who heard them laid them up with their hearts, saying, What then will this child be? For the hand of the Lord was with them. When we look at this story and we see the account of what happens at the birth of John, John the one that baptized in the wilderness, John that prepared the way of Jesus, we see that there is a background between Zacharias and Elizabeth that we're going to be looking at, and we're going to call it the follow-through. Now, I'll start with this story. The hardest part of being my father's son, for me personally, was the fact that he was ridiculously good at baseball. And it was something that he never told me about, actually. Like, it wasn't like sitting me down by the fire and saying, Son, let me tell you about the glory days. It was never that. I found out in late middle school, early high school, when I pulled out this old shoebox that was full of newspaper clippings that his mom had clipped out. And comes to find out, John Miller was like the poster child of the sports section of the newspaper for his entire junior and senior year of high school. He hit home runs in all of these games, and he was this really big deal. And I was reading through him, and I asked him about it and talked to him. And apparently, the way that he humbly tells the story, he was about this far from playing in the minors. But with that in mind, when I had that moment, it made me think back to when I was younger, and we were in the yard, and we were practicing baseball, and we were practicing hitting. And a real bad problem that I had at age 7, so imagine 7-year-old Cameron. And I'm here, and I'm like the kid that's always in the back of the team pictures because I'm one of the bigger ones, and coaches see me walk up, and they think, oh, yeah, we got us a slugger. But there was a problem with that, was because I had this terrible habit of I could never follow through. When little 8-year-old Cameron could never follow through, and it was a habit that had to be broke, and he kept telling me, son, you're getting up here and you're one of the biggest guys on the field, but it's almost like you're slapping at the ball. So I would get into a swing, and you can see it right there. I would go through the entire motion, but as soon as the bat would hit the ball, it's like I would stop swinging. It's like everything would just halt right there, and the ball wasn't going anywhere. Nothing was coming out of it because I wasn't fully following through. And I hope at this point in the sermon I have all of the sports people just right here for the next 20 minutes. And what he had to teach me and what he had to show me was it wasn't just about the initial motion. It wasn't just about the first step of getting everything together. You have to be able to finish what you start. You have to be able to follow through with that initial momentum, that initial conviction. And little 8-year-old Cameron had a lot of lessons to learn. And when we look at the story of Zacharias and Elizabeth, we see a beautiful story of two people that were able to follow through. When we go back, we look at one of the best sermons I've ever heard was given by Matt Cook right here about this very story a few weeks ago. When we look at the beginning of chapter 1, what we saw was that Zacharias and Elizabeth, Zacharias was approached by an angel telling him, "You're going to give birth to this man by the name of John, and he's going to do big things. He's going to do special things, and he's going to do them for my son to prepare the way for him for my kingdom." And from that point on, what we see is that there's this culmination of God's plan that's working and that's happening in these two people. Because it's not just that they're going to give you a son and he's going to be righteous. It's that this son that we're going to give you is going to prepare the way for the very Messiah that our people need right now. And the reason that it was my favorite sermon is because she was barren. God took their greatest struggle. And God took the thing that kept them up at night. And God took the thing that put them through tears. And He used that very thing, the thing that they struggled with, to be what they had to glorify Him. He added that as part of their plan to do great things for Him. And that's so awesome to me because we look at how God has already done the heavy lifting. He's already made out the plan. He's already laid it out for them. But it doesn't stop there. They have to actually take the initiative to follow through with what God started. God set the ball in motion. God's activated them. He's enacted them. He's given them everything. But that doesn't mean that they can just sit back and let it all happen, let it all unravel around them, unfold. They have to be able to do their part and play their part in God's plan. And they have to be able to follow through with what He's laid out for them. And notice, if we look at the text, it's not something that was necessarily easy for them to do. It's not something that just came naturally. It's not like, I'm going to give you this plan and you're going to go about your daily life and it's just all going to happen. It's just all going to come together. No, look at what happened in verse 57 to verse 66. You had two people that when John was brought into this world and it was time for him to be named, everybody was questioning their decision. Everybody was wondering, why would you name him that? That's ridiculous. And it goes back to, if you look at the beginning of chapter 1, you see that Zacharias and Elizabeth had already undergone so much pressure, had already gone so much scrutiny, because back then being barren meant that people took that as there was some sort of sin that you committed. There's something that you did wrong, and that's why you're barren. They already had all of that pressure that was on them. And then this huge blessing comes to them, and once again we see that they defy social standards. And they're able to say, no, we're not going to name him something that glorifies us. We're not going to name him something that carries on our family's honor. We're not going to name something that conforms to the honor-shame society that we're immersed in. We're going to name him what it takes for us to name him in order for it to align with God's plan. And Zacharias, even though he was mute, he thought back to that moment, and he knew when that angel said, "And he will be named John." And all of that comes into fruition, and all of that comes into culmination right here in this very passage. And so it leads us to ask the question, what about us? Let me run you through a hypothetical situation. It is a Sunday morning, and you wake up and you get up a little bit late, so you run through all of the motions of getting ready, and you get in the car, and maybe you listen to your favorite praise and harmony hymns on the way to church, and you're either riding with your spouse or your roommate. Maybe you have some kids that are in the back seat that are being real loud, and you get here, and it's like the first time that you take a deep breath, you're sitting down in one of these chairs, and it's like, finally I'm here, okay? And then you go through class, and that really warms you up. It gets you thinking right. It gets your mind on spiritual things. And since he's not here, I can say this. And then Matt gets up, and Matt brings this lesson that you thought would never be able to come out of a text like that just absolutely wrecks your world spiritually. And you're right here, and you're feeding off of everything that he's saying, because it feels like he's talking right at you. I know, I've been there. I do it with you guys every Sunday. Or maybe Randy gets up and he has these points through in his sermon, and you look at him and you think to yourself, those were meant for me. That sermon that he just preached was meant for me. And we get in this point, in this state where we realize that there is something, there's a reason that God has placed us right here, right now, in this moment, and there's a reason that I'm hearing what I'm hearing right now, and I need to do something. I need to change somehow. I need to leave here and take what I just heard with me. And in the back of our minds, we formulate this plan, right? In the back of our minds, we tell ourselves, based on what I've just heard, here's what I'm going to do. Or based on what I just heard, here's what I'm not going to do once I leave here. And we're 100% full steam ahead, committed, all gas, no brakes, and we go out that door, and we're great, man. We're doing great for the first day, first 2 days, and then Tuesday rolls around, and you're at work, and somebody says something cross to you, and there it goes. Or maybe it's Wednesday and you're in the dorm and those people are talking bad about that person that you have very strong opinions about and you just can't hold back and you want to throw your 2 cents in. Maybe make it to Thursday night and it hits 1:34 a.m. and you look over at your phone and you're dying just to hit that private search. I don't know what it is, but it seems to me that for myself and quite possibly for y'all, that we are a people that are great at being convicted. Amazing at being convicted. We love it. We feed off of it. We come here to places like this. Quite possibly the reason that you chose to make your church home here at Stantonville is because this is a place where you can come to feel convicted to be closer to Christ and be better. That's why I'm here, isn't it? Why you're here? And as Christians, we're people that love to be motivated and love to be moved and love to have this idea of going out and doing something better than I was yesterday, being someone better than I was yesterday until it comes to the follow-through. And I do it every single time. It eventually hits some kind of sticking point. It eventually hits some kind of wall. And it goes from full steam ahead, no turning back, to what conviction? What conviction? And our hearts are soft and they're able to be pricked, but sometimes when it comes to leaving here and putting it into action, what we found is that our will is just as soft as our heart is. And so we ask the question, well I understand, but how did Zacharias do it? How did Elizabeth do it? How did they make such a difference in their lives and follow through with this conviction that they had? I want to understand, and that's an amazing question. They teach us a lot of really good lessons about it. And the first one being, I go back to the initial illustration. Okay, so zoom back to however many years ago. I'm doing the math, like 13, 14, 15 years ago. In my front yard that you've never seen before, just imagine it. That me Father is standing there and he's trying to teach me how to follow through with the rest of my swing. Like don't just stop halfway, follow through. And you know what finally clicked with me? Because what would happen, the way that my learning curve works is I would get it figured out and it would work flawlessly like 2 times. And then I would forget everything that I just learned and recess all the way back into where I started and have to start the whole process all over again. I'm sure it's incredibly frustrating for a father, and I hope my kids aren't that way because I won't be able to have the patience. But he did. My dad did. And what finally clicked for me was he said, "You're following through because you know that you have to. Like you're following through just because you feel like it's something to add on to the end of your swing." And what he said was this: don't follow through just for the sake of following through. Have so much momentum in your swing. Swing so hard that you can't not follow through. Does that make sense? Have so much initial oomph, for lack of a better term, that you can't not carry out what you started and finish through. And the exact same thing is found in the story of Zacharias and Elizabeth. Their initial conviction that they had, the initial momentum that they gained when they were faced with that angel before God was something that was so great that it didn't even cross their mind, the idea of not following through. Look back at the text when we see that they have these people that are sitting here standing saying, "What are you doing naming him John? What are you talking about? You've already gone through so much scrutiny about being barren. You've already gone through so much heartache about not being able to have a child, and now you finally have one, and you're going to name him some random name, John?" And they didn't even bat an eye at it. They didn't think twice. They didn't say, well, let's have a conversation among ourselves and then we'll decide what the name. No. They looked at that group of people square in the eyes, and Elizabeth said, no, he shall be called John, verse 60. And then the father, who couldn't even speak, went and got him a wax tablet, and he brought and he wrote the very words, his name is John. And there was no looking back. There was no turning back. It was a conviction that carried them through from the very moment that angel looked at Zacharias and said, do not fear, to the very end of John's life. It was a conviction that they didn't feel like they had to follow through out of obligation, but rather they could not follow through because their trust in God was so great. Because they didn't know, they didn't see the whole picture, weren't able to zoom out and read the story that we were able to read. They didn't fully understand and fully comprehend through just mere prophecy that's being told to them exactly how it was going to happen and exactly what was going to happen, but they knew that the one that was in control of it all, and they knew that the God that was behind the entire plan was so great that they could trust in Him to take care of it, and they could trust in Him to handle it no matter how much they did or didn't know. And in the same way, when we're convicted, ought we be so convicted and have such a great trust in God that when we leave this place, there's no question, there's no debate, there's no discussion. There's no more loss of that initial fire, but rather a complete and total devotion to Him. Now, we understand one thing that I want to make a point of. We have seen an accumulative, I'm guessing, based on what I've seen, what I've calculated, not a math major, but I'm going to go as far as to say we've seen about a half a day total of Zacharias and Elizabeth's life. Give or take about half a day's worth of their entire lives. All we know about them in chapter 1, verse 6, they were righteous people. We know that in chapter 1, verse 13, that they were burdened with not being able to have children, and that God delivers that. But we sometimes, I tell myself, these people, I can't do what they did. I can't follow through the way that they did. Because it says in verse 6 how righteous they were and how upstanding they were. And what I forget is we have seen half a day's worth of their life. And in the same way that our humanity is imperfect, so is theirs. There's nothing about them that would indicate or suggest that from the moment that God initially had His plan laid out to the very end, that they never stumbled. There's nothing to tell us that they never faltered. On the contrary, why was Zacharias mute? Because when God first approached him, he didn't fully trust and he didn't fully believe. He questioned God. And so in this story, we don't just see a group of people following through. We see two people follow through that were as imperfect as we are. That were as broken as we are. And what initially we think about and feel like I can never do that, rather we see that's not the case at all. And what we've done and what I've done is I've allowed failure to become my new standard. And I've just gotten so used to falling out on convictions and falling out on times that God has put something right in front of me for the sake of me changing for the better, me failing on that it's become the new normal. It's become something that I feel like that is what it means, because the process, maybe it is for you, that you come to church and then you leave here with something to change. But then by the time it dies out, we just kind of throw in the towel and let the fire die. Why? Well, because Wednesday night we're going to come back and do it again. Well, because by next Sunday I'm going to be right here being convicted about something else again. I'm going to be at a club devo, or I'm going to be at Clayton Chapel, or I'm going to be doing whatever. I'm going to just be reconvicted all over again. And we've gotten into this vicious, monotonous cycle of over and over and over again being convicted by God, having a really good run, and then falling out. But it's okay, because in just a short amount of time, in just a few days, we're going to be convicted again by God just so that we can fall right back out. And it's a trap that I've fallen in, and a trap that maybe you've fallen in as well. And the example that Zacharias and Elizabeth lay out for us is something so much bigger and so much better than that. what God has planned for you and what God has planned for us is so much bigger and so much better than just a monotonous cycle of conviction, failure, repeat. It's something that's seen and it's something that's exemplified in the prophecy that Zechariah speaks. God's plan, they were convicted, greater than their circumstances surrounding them. And the reason that their conviction was strong enough to carry them through from beginning to end is because their conviction wasn't their own. Their conviction was of God. It came from somewhere higher than themselves. And you look at it and you read through this prophecy. I would encourage you to do that. We see that in verse 68, it's shown that God is the one that, blessed be the Lord God. He is the one that's behind this plan. He's the one that's in control of this plan. Then we go a little bit further down into verse 72, 3 and 4, and we see that God is working for His people. God doesn't just have this big plan. He has this big plan that is for the Jewish nation. It's for Zacharias and Elizabeth. It's for us. It's for salvation. And then we go a little bit further down and we see that in verse 76, God didn't just say, I've got it, I have a plan, and it's going to be in your benefit. He shows us how He's going to do it. In verse 76, and you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare His ways, to give knowledge of salvation to His people. God's always been a how God. He hasn't just told you what He's going to do. He's told you how He's going to do it so often. And He has His plan. And this plan that they have perfectly played into is seen in their very lives. And they know that it's there because it's working. Look at verses 65 and 66. What did the people do? As soon as his mouth was open, Zacharias began to speak, and the first thing he did was praise God. I think that's an entire sermon all in itself. But then verses 65 and 66 is the beginning of God's plan. Everyone marveled and everyone was talking about it as to what's this child going to become? Who's this child going to be? This story about Zacharias, he was mute and now he's not, and his child's born, but he doesn't have a very normal name. And then there's this prophecy that goes along with it talking about salvation and a Messiah. It was all part of the plan. Because had this not happened, John's message would not have been validified. Had John's message not been validified, there would have been no use for the voice crying in the wilderness, because no one would have had any reason to listen. No one had any reason to listen. Nobody would have been led to the Messiah when He came. Had nobody been led to the Messiah when He came, I'll let you fill in the end. It's all part of this beautiful plan that Zacharias and Elizabeth, though they didn't totally understand it, though they didn't totally know exactly step by step how it was going to happen, they were convicted by it and they trusted in it. They lived this plan, they loved this plan, and they embodied it with their lives so that others would see it. And in others seeing this plan that ended in salvation, they were pointing to God. God's plan was what moved them. It wasn't them. It wasn't the words of people. And so often I think the reason that I get in the cycle of conviction, fail, start over, is because my conviction doesn't always come from a higher source. You come and you sit down and we have a Sunday morning and we hear something that Matt or Randy brings. And notice kind of sometimes like if you mute the TV and you put on subtitles and it's a show that you normally watch, you read things and you hear them in your head in the voice of the character that you know from the episodes you've watched in the past. Does that make sense, right? We do that. In the same way, the convictions that I leave here with, so often when I replay them in my head with those subtitles, I hear them in the voice of Matt. And I hear them in the voice of Randy. Which is kind of weird to think about, but we do. And so often, our convictions aren't coming from God and our convictions aren't coming from His Word, but rather from the way that they're eloquently presented. Guilty. I do that all the time. And we wonder why our convictions are failing, and it's because a lot of times they're coming from a failed source. From an imperfect source. God uses mouthpieces and He uses people to give us His message and to move us, but He doesn't do it for us to see them. He doesn't do it for us to see the preachers and the teachers. He does it for us to hear Him speaking, for us to hear His Word speaking, that His Word might move us to do great things, and His Word might move us to become a part in His amazing, beautiful plan that He has in your life and in your world. When we begin to see that He is the one that's calling us to action, and when I begin to see that He is the one that is moving us to do things that draw us closer to Him, and when I'm replaying those convictions in my head throughout the week, if I'm seeing them from His perspective, coming from Him and His voice instead of the voice of others, that's where things begin to change. That's the difference in me and Zacharias. That's the difference in us and Elizabeth, is because they knew that the plan that they were following wasn't something of man. It wasn't something that was faulty. It wasn't something that could just be thrown away. It says in the prophecy that he reads, it's from God. And by it being from God, it is imperfect. It is perfect. It's not imperfect. And it'll always follow through as long as they follow through. As long as they follow through. So the question that I'll ask you this morning is how has your follow through been? People ask sometimes what the hardest part about this job is. And you know, like you get time to talk to a really big name preacher. One of the first things that people always ask him, do you get nervous, or how long do you prepare for a lesson or whatever? And if you ask me what the hardest part of this job is, I think across the board, it's the feeling of inadequacy, knowing that you're standing before a group of people that you're just as imperfect as, if not more imperfect than, and preaching from a word as if you have any right to. And I get hooked on words, like if that makes any sense. And this is a word that I've been hooked on for about a month now. Is this overwhelming feeling of inadequacy? Because you get in front of a group of people and you speak, and it almost feels like this righteousness goes along with the position, and it shouldn't. Because as I stand before you this morning, I feel as inadequate as anyone in this room. A lot more inadequate than some people in this room. As I look at Randy and Danny, my grandfather, and others. But I'll say this. The reason that we were given this place, and the reason that we were given this church, is for our feelings of inadequacy. Quite possibly this morning you're looking at your cycle of convictions and your cycle of following through or lack thereof, and you're thinking to yourself that you just feel completely and totally inadequate before God. Join the club. Welcome. And quite possibly this morning, His Word and His plan have motivated you to a point of wanting to change. And maybe you want prayers for that. Maybe you have been motivated to change a lot of times in the past, and it hasn't worked out, and it hasn't followed through, and you want it to this time, and you want His plan to be at work in your life, then we'll pray about it. James 5:16, that's what this place is for. Quite possibly you've never been saved, you've never been baptized, and you want to know exactly how you can spend a home in heaven with Jesus. We'll do that as well. Mark 16:16. If you have any need, please make it known as together we stand and as we sing.